Theories of gender socialization. We know that socialization is a very important social process whereby the culture in a society is transmitted from one generation to another generation, from one group to another group, from parents to children. And during this process, we learn our cultural norms, beliefs, values, and different systems and traditions, and which includes gender roles also. Gender and gender roles and gender identity is learned during this socialization process in the very beginning. There are different theories we know that explain how gender learning takes place during this socialization process. One of these theories, which is a very interesting theory, is the social learning theory. As the very name suggests, this theory has to do with learning. It believes that these things are learned, and they are learned through the social environment and the people around a person. Socialization is learned through consequences of behavior. That is, the consequences of a behavior will determine whether this behavior will be repeated or not. So, if a child is going to learn a particular gender role for a boy or for a girl, it will depend upon how the parents have encouraged the child. Similarly, for some behaviors, children may be snubbed. So we see that there are different consequences of behavior which work as reinforcement and which determine whether the behavior will be repeated or not. And this is how appropriate behaviors are encouraged and inappropriate or undesirable behaviors are discouraged. There are primarily three possible consequences of a behavior. Positive consequence, which means something like a reward, which encourages a person. Negative consequence, which is negative in nature. It can be in the form of punishment, or it can be in the form of negative reinforcement. And no consequence. There are behaviors which may not be followed by any consequence at all, but it has its effect. So we see that any behavior, whether it is a gender-related behavior or a general behavior, may have three possible consequences, but we can see them in terms of four consequences. The positive consequence is a reward that leads to encouragement. A negative consequence can be of two types, like it can be punishment, something negative happening to the child, and which snubs the child and stops the child from doing a certain behavior. But it can be negative consequence also, which is negative reinforcement, which means a negative stimulus is experienced, but in order to get away with that stimulus and get it over with, the person does a certain action, which means the action will be repeated. And then there can be no consequence at all. But although we tend to ignore this type of behavior, but this no consequence has a very deep impact on behavior. It can work very well with children when we are teaching them certain behaviors. So let's see how these consequences work. Learning gender behavior. A son copies his father and tries to adopt his behaviors and behaves just like the father. This behavior is reinforced through appreciation from the parents. And since the child is getting appreciation, the response will be repeated. So, positive reinforcement or reward is operating here. On the other hand, a girl works in the kitchen. As a consequence, she avoids harsh treatment, because if she doesn't work in the kitchen, although she doesn't like it, but if she doesn't work over there, then she receives harsh treatment. Therefore, she works in the kitchen in order to avoid the harsh treatment by the mother. As a consequence, the response will be repeated, which means negative reinforcement has actually encouraged the young girl to do domestic chores. And this is how we teach many young girls in our society. So we see that negative consequences have their own impact and positive consequences have their own impact. But as we said earlier, there is another consequence which can be the punishment. And punishment, we know, is used to stop behaviors. It is used as a deterrent. So a boy, a son who is playing with dolls, who likes to play with dolls, he is punished for this behavior. And the punishment is in the form of ridicule and scolding from the mother, from the father, or maybe the elder siblings. Therefore, as a consequence, the response will not be repeated. So we see that punishment helps stop or change the course of a certain behavior. On the other hand, there is a response that a boy likes washing his clothes. Although it is not generally considered to be a boy's task, nobody pays attention to this behavior. No reinforcement is given to the boy. Nobody pays attention. As a consequence, the response will not be repeated. If a girl was doing this behavior, she would have been encouraged. But when the boy is doing that, people tend to ignore that, and as a result, he will not do it in future. So we see that gender socialization for boys and girls takes place through social learning processes. But there is a lot of research in psychology and sociology that shows that gender socialization is difficult for boys and it is easier for girls. How is it possible? The thing is, children, when they are learning social behaviors, they are using modeling and social learning and observational learning. So for a boy who is very close to his mother, like all children, boys also are very close to their mothers. But the mother is not the role model for the boy. Therefore, it is difficult for the boy, the male child, to learn different behaviors. On the other hand, it is very easy for a girl to learn different behaviors that are taught to girls. She has to become like her mother. She is like any other child, very close to her mother, and she copies her behaviors and gradually she becomes like the mother. But at the same time, we see that in some cases, socialization may be difficult for girls also. How? Because there are very high sets of standards and expectations attached with girls. They have to look prim and proper all the time. They have to be polite. They have to be soft-spoken. They have to be behaving well, dress up very well, and they should not show any anger. They should control their emotions. So all of these standards are difficult, which have been set for women, and it is difficult for a young girl to cope with these things also. But as we see that socialization is a process which takes place naturally, and one way or the other, children do learn their behaviors that the society expects them to learn.